This week, I'm gonna talk about how I edit my photography. This is a really exciting topic for me, and I have a couple of my favorite shots lined up that I'm gonna walk you through the editing process of. I personally think editing should never be what makes a photo. For me, it's always more of a finishing touch, which is why personally I'm not afraid to share my editing process. I know a lot of photographers don't necessarily talk about it because they don't want people copying their editing. But for me, it's more of a finishing touch, so I'm excited to show you how I edit my photography. I'm gonna start with the gear that I use. I edit in Adobe Lightroom because I think it's a great balance between being able to edit a lot of photos quickly, but it also gives you a ton of creative control and you can get experimental with your colors in Lightroom. And I also want to give a huge shout out to Loupedeck for sponsoring this video. Loupedeck is the dedicated keyboard and editing panel that I use to edit my photography. They hit me up a while back to see if I would be interested in having a video sponsored by them. And I wasn't using Loupedeck at the time, so I said, send me one. I'm excited to try it out, and if I like it, then maybe we can go forward. And over the past months, it's kind of become an essential part of my workflow. At first, I thought it seemed a little unnecessary to have a dedicated editing panel for photography, but I realized quickly that because I'm spending 90% of my time on my computer editing photography, it definitely makes sense to have a dedicated keyboard for it because a mouse and keys weren't designed for Lightroom. Even though you can have keyboard shortcuts and all that, I really like the Loupedeck because you have physical dials that correspond to everything in Adobe Lightroom specifically. It also works for Premiere Pro and I use it for color grading my videos. But this thing was designed with Lightroom in mind, and it's made my editing experience so much more intuitive and straightforward. All that being said, I'm really excited to show you my editing process, so let's get started with some photos. This is what my setup looks like. I have the Loupedeck right here and I have a couple of my favorite shots to edit. There's a mix of medium and large format, so it should be a good bunch to edit. I'm gonna get started on my first shot, which is an image of this church in New Jersey from a series that I've been working on. And the first thing I noticed is that in the scan holder that I used, it wasn't lined up. So I'm gonna use the auto upright feature to correct the perspective on this image because the symmetry is quite important here. This is done using the auto upright feature, but I have this assigned to a custom function button on the Loupedeck, which is really convenient because it's a feature I use quite a lot. And I'm gonna start here with the temperature because this image is way too warm from the scan that I made. I did scan this myself, so I'm gonna cool it off and add a little bit of magenta, and that seems to do quite a lot. I also want to drop the exposure here maybe down to like -40 because I want this to be a dark and moody image. But then what I'll do is probably raise the highlights quite a bit. Actually, maybe all the way to 99 because that adds some contrast back into the photo. And then I'll drop the shadows, raise the whites, and again, that just adds more contrast. And if we look at the blacks over here, there's not a lot of detail in them. You can see when I try to raise them, there's actually no information there because I intentionally underexpose this image. So I might drop the blacks to make sure that I don't get any grain there. And then I'll move down to the hue, saturation, luminance section. This is where you adjust your colors. Starting with the hues, I'm just gonna change the greens because I want them to be a bit more blue. And I think that makes the plants look a little bit nicer in this photo. And in terms of the saturation, I'll raise it on the greens as well, and probably on the reds and oranges because those are the dominant colors in this photo, is red and orange. And if I hit the before and after button, you can see the white balance correction and the perspective correction does quite a lot for this photo. But now I'm gonna move on to split toning, which is where you add colors to the highlights and the shadows of your image. I'm not gonna necessarily add anything new to the photo here. This is just used to kind of accentuate the colors that are already in this photo, which happen to be red and orange. On the Loupedeck, you can hit the custom mode button, and this allows you to assign custom functions to the dials and everything. I have these 4 right here set up to be my split toning dials, and that makes it really easy to work with. I probably want to start by just adding red to the shadows. You can turn up the saturation all the way to see what color you're actually adding. And I'm gonna go for like a red orange. What you can do is change the balance slider, and this affects how much it's affecting the shadows and how much it's affecting the highlights. I usually like to slide it to the right. In terms of the highlights, I'll probably add something a little bit more yellow greenish, probably an orange like that, and then drop that saturation down to 6. Looks pretty good. Before and after, Looks very nice. I love the colors in this image and I love how symmetrical it is. And yeah, this is part of my new series. My next image is one from the Hasselblad H6D video, if you saw that one. This was actually a lab scan and I like how they have the 645 borders in there, so I'm gonna leave that in. I think most importantly, I'll start with the exposure because I wanna brighten this image up quite a bit. So 35 looks good. I'll also raise the shadows because I like my images very flat and neutral. Probably raise the blacks a little bit, and then to compensate, just drop the whites. And immediately looking at the before and after, that adds more contrast and just gives it that nice bright feel that I like my photos to have. But there's a lot more to do. I'm gonna drop the saturation because I think lab scans are always too saturated. And then I'll mess with the colors a little bit. This is where you get pretty experimental with the hue, saturation, and luminance because every image is different and has different colors in it. Shifting the yellows towards orange takes some of the green tint out of that house. And I always like to shift my greens towards blue a little bit. I think it makes them pop more. Moving on to the split toning, I'm gonna add some red here to kind of counterbalance the green because the shadows look really green right now. You can use split toning to add color to your image, but you can also use it to counterbalance some of the tints in the shadows or the highlights if you don't like them. Because my shadows look very green right now, I'm gonna add red to the shadows, and that should give me a more neutral photo. Again, I'll probably shift the balance sliders so that I see it's only affecting the part of the shadows that I want it to. I'll probably turn the saturation to around 35. I think that looks good. And then to just add some of that warm sunshine feeling to the photo, I'll just add some red in the highlights, not much, just a touch. Looking at the before and after, I think that looks much better. That looks much more like the sunny day that I remember it feeling like, as opposed to the flat and neutral lab scan that I got. If I have similar images such as this one right here, what I can do is go back, just hit the copy button on the Loupedeck. You'll see it says develop settings copied. You can go to the next image, paste those settings, and it's that simple. I really like how that looks. I'm just gonna adjust the exposure. And just like that, it's super easy to move your settings from one photo to the next. The final image I want to edit is this portrait of Duckworth, the hip hop artist who I recently took photos of for a magazine. There will be full video coming about this shoot. But for now, I'm gonna edit this photo because the scan that I made myself of this photo looks really bad. It looks very green, very yellow. And the light that I used to light this photo was tungsten, which means that it has a very warm cast and I want to get rid of some of that warm cast. So I'm still going to start with the basic develop settings. I'll add a touch of blue to the photo, and also because it looks very green, I want to add magenta. And you can see just how much that tint adjustment does for the photo. It's really crucial in photos like this to get the skin tones correct. Usually I like a flat look for my portraits, but because of the way we lit this, I want to add some more contrast. So I'm going to bump up the highlights, drop down the shadows a little bit just to make the focus more on that center circle of light. Probably also drop the blacks and then raise, maybe even lower the whites, and I can add some more highlight in there. I think it's a little too vibrant, so I'll drop the vibrance and maybe add a touch of saturation. Again, this is one of those images that I intentionally metered for the highlights because I knew I wanted that circle to be the main focus. So when you make a flat scan of it, the shadows don't look very good. That's why I like to drop them. And it's just editing the image with the intentions of how I photographed it. I'm gonna mess around with the hues a little bit, but overall I think the color in this image is already pretty good. In terms of the saturation, I'll up the orange, drop red a little bit to make his jacket more subtle. I'll probably also drop the saturation of the blues quite a bit because there's a lot of blue in that outer circle of light. In terms of the split toning, I'm going to use the highlight section to try and counterbalance some of the tungsten color in the circle of light. So I'm just going to start by shifting the balance slider, and I'll turn up the saturation of the highlights to see what I'm adding. And when you see a color that looks quite natural, you can go ahead and drop the saturation to where it looks good. I'll probably leave it quite subtle at 4 because my balance slider is at 80, and that means the highlights are gonna be affected very much and the shadows only a little bit. You can see this is kind of a trend with all these photos, but I'm gonna add red to the shadows. Not too much this time, but I think around 25 looks good. An orange-red color just brings some warmth back. And overall, I think that looks really nice. Just adjusting and correcting for some of those colors really makes the skin tones more natural, and adding a little bit of contrast makes the focus of the image more on that inner circle of light. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up in the comments or on Instagram. My Instagram is @WillemVerb. You can also see more of my work there. Again, big thank you to Loupedeck for sponsoring this video. The links to Loupedeck will be in the description along with my Instagram. And I hope you learned something from my editing process. That's it for this video. Peace.